Lecture 6. Hello. We left off with Homesteads in Wade Graham's book Dream Cities, which gives a pretty good typology of European cities, global cities, in the past 120 years, 140 years. And what we left over from the last lecture was on homestead. We have covered castles, monuments, slabs, homesteads, corrals, malls, habitats. And this response is, I think I'll cover what each category as distinct categories, how they happen as a progression of time, how they happen as a progression of modernity. What do we do with the individual? What do we do with an individual coming from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy? Conjoining that with the notions of catastrophe, as in COVID, but COVID is symptomatic of a larger tipping point that has been happening in the world, and pretty much as a response to post-peak oil, which has been part of the fuel for getting our entire global population up to 8 billion people, and roughly 60% of those people living in large cities, which I read in Architects Anonymous, they call them alpha cities. A note as we proceed on typologies, to consider and remember with the COVID response, with the notion that technology will save us somehow, is a notion that, a very simple notion, that it now takes 10 calories of petroleum to deliver 1 calorie of food to any alpha city. I live in an alpha city, New York City. Those of you who do not practice small-scale architecture are part of the problem and not really part of the solution of distribution of food. We soon will have a shortage of materials, most notably food and drinking water. And one of the larger questions that COVID, as our friend, as put a shot across our bow, is this unlimited growth tenable? So let's go back to the use value, the explanation of how each city forms, the aesthetics, certainly, because we are very aesthetic animals. We respond to beauty. So let's go back to leaving off with homesteads, because we are lecturing here in America, and it is a very particular nation. Homesteads, sprawl. Homesteads are single-family houses on land outside city centers with pseudo-rural qualities, i.e. parks, but not agricultural parks, not usually a place to take your food from. It suggests agrarian self-sufficiency, though they are not in reality farms, but typical bedroom communities for urban areas and homes for retirees. The idea of getting away from it all. College towns, suburbs, but we'll cover that later. But places, as we saw in the response to COVID, places to get away from it all during COVID, as the lockdown, the sequestering of public space happened. In New York City, as a matter of fact, being a very inventive city, we placed little huts in parking areas where cars were formerly supposed to park. It did two things. It got rid of this sort of ascendancy of preference towards automobiles and parkings. It reestablished outdoor eating areas where supposedly ventilation could happen better, keeping the COVID virus away from grouped individuals. And it was fun like Europe. We could see these outdoor places happening, and the response was very wonderful. I myself had eaten many 2-3 times a week out in these little huts in the streets of Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan, where you're exposed to the winter air. So they were very cold in general. They had heaters, supposedly ventilated. We would wear masks going to the bathrooms and so forth, but at the table we could be mask free. And this was a way to contain the spread of the COVID virus. These homesteads, though, as a counter idea to the cosmopolitan sense of the city, is that these areas were radically decentralized, that they have no functional center, virtually no mass transportation, and it gave a preference to the internal combustion engine and the automobile. I had seen a special on Henry Ford and many interesting factors out of the invention of the Model T, a very, very revolutionary device, was that agrarian types could overcome their alienation, their spatial alienation. They could go see each other, which formerly they would do by horse and carriage, or like in any of those cowboy films. The preference of the homestead toward the automobile is legendary, and we have different manifestations. We should consider in this whole interlocking intellectual picture of post-peak oil, what have we done with 500 million years of stored social energy? How have we spent it? Did we really squander it? Yes. But what were the alternatives? And then this creation of the slab cities, homesteads, corrals, corals, a coral foundation, malls, and habitats is still quasi being sensitive or contingent on the car, which is really more or less a detached room to a house. If you were a farmer in Oklahoma and Texas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, during the 20s, the heyday of the Model T, you had a way out, a way over your alienation into the lives of others. In this great North American expanse, you could spread out. That is coming to a screaming halt. As post-peak oil reaches its apex downward, we simply don't know what we will do getting food to these alpha cities. Cities were centers of diversity and cosmopolitanism, but they were also cities fed by trucks and food trucks. Allegedly, there's 3 days of food supply in any one of these great alpha cities. What can we do using COVID as a kind of warning signal? What can we do to mitigate all those factors? So I'm focusing on this notion of urban, suburban, extra-urban. Is it agrarian? Is it rural? Is it a retirement community? Is it a little country college? What is it? Is it a retreat by a yuppie couple trying to get out of New York City during the height of COVID? These are interesting formulation. The architectural style of these areas are nonspecific and from historically themed subdivisions and carefully controlled gated communities to random commercial vernacular. Or these became former satellite towns, such as the one I grew up in, and I grew up rurally in rural Minnesota, outside of Minneapolis, that these agrarian towns were subsumed as bedroom communities as highways increased, not so much as mass transit increased, because of this need to be anywhere at any time at your own will and discretion. That's the essence of the car, the detached rooms. Building forms is predominantly detached residential, but it can include pockets and mixes in multiple areas. Residential to industrial to agricultural can coexist, but we are preferentially sited in peripheral or quasi-rural sprawl zones. It's classical urban sprawl, eating away at agrarian land. Some examples are cities' edges on highways. We have peripheries of most American cities, first and second ring suburban confluences in Detroit, Minneapolis, Cleveland, Indianapolis, Bozeman, Montana, all these things that even had alternative communities, as in New Jersey, in Maryland, to the perceived notion of what extra urban sites should be. Phoenix, Arizona, Orlando, Florida, Santa Clarita, California. The California cities consist of a sprawl where barely agrarian culture. Long Island, New York, where the wine and potato and the flower markets of Long Island have been overcome by the fantastic property increase in creating suburban areas for service economies, post-industrial service economies. So we see that trend. Moving on further into corrals. Jane Jacobs, Andreas Doheny, and the self-organized city. The idea that the city is an antheap. And Jane Jacobs stood up to Robert Moses and his rational order, preventing the kind of cold dissection of the city as a mauling of the historical layers of a city from the castles, monuments, slabs, homesteads. Corrals, this notion of the best order is a self-governing order, self-organizing, self-governing order, and Jane Jacobs as a advocate of self-determination, mostly in the West Village, as she stood up to Robert Moses, is a prime example. Even though, as famously put, her house, which went up for sale in the early aughts, sold for a couple $1 million. The homely aspect of the cities within cities had certainly expanded into this land speculation. What corrals have code-controlled architecture. Groups of buildings or entire communities share a single historicist site. West Village. Building form is contained in a range of heights and sizes, much like organic growth. This is the concept that the modernist city is actually the organic city. Signage, street furniture, trees, and landscaping are designed according to a planning code. So there are algorithms to this, but from that they proceed into this sort of natural growth. Jane Jacobs famously put in the life and death of great American cities, that using Hudson Street and the West Village as an example, contra to Robert Mose's slab cities, is that the grandmas and the cousins and the nephews and the other mothers would watch over the children playing on the street, creating a sort of an organic feeling of contractual relationships within larger cities, that police and order and fear that your child will be abducted is mitigated by creating smaller communities within a larger alpha city like New York City. West Village was Italo-American, Jewish American, and Bohemian, and these people could, in a sense, self-police. One of the features is that it wasn't quite a racially diverse area. So when Jane Jacobs wrote of this in the 50s, 60s, it was a simpler time and simpler sort of set of prognostications for that. Variety. The limits are prescribed by code. The styles, the colors, the materials vary. Building heights, masses, setback from street vary. Pretty much taking over from the existing order. I live in Brooklyn. There are parts of Bed-Stuy, certainly Park Slope, which is year to year historically the most desirable area in New York to live. Beautiful brownstone. There is a rendering of continuity and aesthetics, which render, not just aesthetic appreciation, but mental hygiene. These things are important for a layering of history. No longer do we see the slab city placed on top of a city like Paris or New York, or we saw with Le Corbusier's Robert Mose's plan to slice through middle of neighborhoods with highways as arteries for the detached car, using petroleum gathered for 500 million years. So that in a sense there's a Faustian response to all of this, that there's no hell to pay. There's no ultimate comeuppance or decision to live through what you would know as the end of post-peak oil. So in Spengler's sense, we do have from the Renaissance onward this notion created by the one-point perspective as a metaphor. Now, we live in a Faustian condition that we are using our rational faculties against the notion that in the future they will be a hell to play. When you design a city as slabs, there might be attendant social unrest of people removed from their dignity, living like hamsters. If you create the suburbs with the car as principal mass transit, you might create a situation in which the petroleum is felt never to give up, never to let through. Mixed-use neighborhoods consist of deliberately mixed residency, retail, and other businesses, places of employment, schools, recreation, the burbs. The way Frank Lloyd Wright had designed this for this Usonian project, the aesthetic burbs, coming out of the arts and crafts movement and utopian communities of America. Did it quite turn into this? No, because there was also rampant speculation on what new generation wanted to live in the detached house in a nuclear family with mother, father, brother, sister, of that sort. On Long Island, we see many South Asians living in 3 stories of these houses, whole family with extended families of grandparents, adding an East Asian spin to this, which is very interesting and obviously contrary to the notion of the homesteads, but the corals too. Everyone gets the gig, right? Everyone knows what their roles. Well, now we're inviting people in who are playing upon those roles in different ways. The detached houses are now housing 2 or 3 different first-generation Americans. A vast change. Moving on. Multimodal transportation. The neighborhoods are pedestrian friendly, but ... bike friendly, but ... Can you get to the store? Accommodating cars is the non-dominant role, but had become that. Narrow streets,